station, where unknown forces strike the edge of ecology.
Okay, my name is Matt Campbell, and my brother Jeff was one of the 67 British victims that died on 9/11. Whether you believe in the official conspiracy of 9/11 or you subscribe to one of the many counter-conspiracies, please try and keep an open mind during my presentation. There will be time for Q&A afterwards. I want to talk first of all about, from my perspective, a family member, the absence of justice, the absence of evidence, and the absence of remains. And then I want to look at two areas of research of 9/11 which I think deserve more focus and attention than they're actually currently getting. And for those, if this is completely new to you, this is a tiny subset of things that run counter to the official narrative. And I'm sure some of you have seen this before, it's the Corbett report, but I think it's an excellent 5-minute summary of the official conspiracy theory.
Did you go forward?
I've gone backwards, but it's probably...
Yeah, go forward again.
Yeah?
Yeah.
And then
And again. Yeah. It was running earlier.
It was, yeah.
It was definitely running earlier.
It's probably quite hungry for me. That's, yeah, it's going. You've got the volume on.
Yeah.
No, that's just the
No,
presentation.
that's not it, is it? What we can do
Just
is
come out and come
let's
back
come
in.
out of
Yeah.
presenter mode and just go into it this way, I think.
Yep.
On the morning of September 11th, 2001, 19 men armed with box cutters, directed by a man on dialysis in a cave fortress halfway around the world, using a satellite phone and a laptop, directed the most sophisticated penetration of the most heavily defended airspace in the world, overpowering the passengers and the military combat-trained pilots on 4 commercial aircraft before flying those planes wildly off course for over an hour without being molested by a single fighter interceptor. These 19 hijackers, devout religious fundamentalists who like to drink alcohol, snort cocaine, and live with pink-haired strippers, managed to knock down 3 buildings with 2 planes in New York. While in Washington, a pilot who couldn't handle a single-engine Cessna was able to fly a 757 in an 8,000-foot descending 270-degree corkscrew turn to come exactly level with the ground, hitting the Pentagon and the Budget Analyst Office, where DoD staffers were working on the mystery of the $2.3 trillion that Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld had announced missing from the Pentagon's coffers in a press conference the day before, on September 10th, 2001. Luckily, the news anchors knew who did it within minutes.
Osama bin Laden.
The pundits knew within hours.
Osama bin Laden.
The administration knew within the day.
Terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbored them.
And the evidence literally fell into the FBI's lap.
That a hijacker's passport was found blocks from the World Trade Center crash site. We can believe that.
But for some reason, a bunch of crazy conspiracy theorists demanded an investigation into the greatest attack on American soil in history. That investigation was delayed, underfunded, set up to fail, a conflict of interest, and a cover-up from start to finish. It was based on testimony extracted through torture, the records of which were destroyed. It failed to mention the existence of WTC-7, Able Danger, P-TECH, Sibel Edmonds, OBL and the CIA, and the drills of hijacked aircraft being flown into buildings that were being simulated at the precise same time that those events were actually happening. It was lied to by the Pentagon, the CIA, the Bush administration, and as for Bush and Cheney, well, no one knows what they told it because they testified in secret, off the record, not under oath, and behind closed doors. It didn't bother to look at who funded the attacks because that question is ultimately of little practical significance. Still, the 9/11 Commission did brilliantly, answering all of the questions the public had, except most of the victims' family members' questions, and pinned blame on all the people responsible, although no one so much as lost their job, determining the attacks were
failure of imagination.
Because
Nobody in our government, at least, and I don't think the prior government could envision flying airplanes into buildings.
except the Pentagon, FEMA, NORAD, and the NRO. The DIA destroyed 2.5 terabytes of data on Able Danger, but that's okay because it probably wasn't important. The FCC destroyed their records on the investigation into the insider trading before the attacks, but that's okay because destroying the records of the largest investigation in SEC history is just part of routine record keeping. NIST has classified the data that they used for their model of WTC7's collapse, but that's okay because knowing how they made their model of the collapse would jeopardize public safety. The FBI has argued that all material related to their investigation of 9/11 should be kept secret from the public, but that's okay because the FBI probably has nothing to hide. This man never existed, nor is anything he had to say worthy of your attention, and if you say otherwise, you are a paranoid conspiracy theorist and deserve to be shunned by all of humanity. Likewise him, and her, and her, and her, and him. Osama bin Laden lived in the cave fortress in the hills of Afghanistan, but somehow got away. Then he was hiding out in Tora Bora, but somehow got away. Then he lived in Abbottabad for years, taunting the most comprehensive intelligence dragnet employing the most sophisticated technology in the history of the world for a decade, releasing video after video with complete impunity and getting younger and younger as he did so, before finally being found in a daring SEAL team raid which wasn't recorded on video, in which he didn't resist or use his wife as a human shield, and in which these crack special forces operatives panicked and killed this unarmed man, supposedly the best source of intelligence about those dastardly terrorists on the entire planet. Then they dumped his body in the ocean before telling anyone about it. Then a couple dozen of that team's members died in a helicopter crash in Afghanistan. This is the story of 9/11, brought to you by the media which told you the hard truths about
His head could be seen to move violently forward.
and
They took the babies out of incubators.
and
Mobile production facilities.
and
The rescue of Jessica Lynch.
if you have any questions about this story, you are a batshit paranoid tinfoil dog-abusing baby hater and will be reviled by everyone. If you love your country and or freedom, happiness, rainbows, rock and roll, puppy dogs, apple pie, and your grandma, you will never ever express doubts about any part of this story to anyone. Ever. This has been a public service announcement by the Friends of the FBI, CIA, NSA, DIA, SEC, NSM, White House, NIST, and the 9/11 Commission. Because ignorance is strength.
Always worth seeing. Corbett report for those that don't know where it's come from. So the World Trade Center wasn't my brother's place of work. A lot of the British victims, I think there were 10 in total, were either attendees or were employees of Risk Waters, who were running a conference on the 106th floor of the North Tower. On 9/11, Jeff was one of those attendees, and this clip is probably the last seconds of his life. Jeff was 31, a year younger than me. He worked for Reuters, and I last saw him at the end of August in 2001, and he came over for a flying visit with his new fiancée, Caroline, a girl that he met, she's from Boston. He'd met her since moving out to Manhattan in 1999. Do that. Under European human rights, victims have a right to the truth, where their right of life has been violated. The mass murder of 3,000 people was a gross violation of their rights. The United States, as a state party to the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, is under the obligation to provide an effective remedy to the victims of 9/11, including their right to an effective investigation of these violations. According to paragraph 16 of the UN Principles, families of the deceased and their legal representatives shall be informed of and have access to any hearing, as well as to all information relevant to the investigation, and shall be entitled to present other evidence. And I can tell you that none of that has happened. Has there been any justice? As family members, all we have is the 9/11 Commission report. The 9/11 Commission was only set up in the first place because the victim family members put pressure on the Bush administration to have an investigation. It took them 411 days to set up the commission. 411 days to look into the mass murder of 3,000 people. The funding set aside for the commission was initially set at $3 million, and after more prodding, they increased it to $14 million. Now that might sound a lot, but when you compare that to $50 million for the Challenger disaster, and even more for investigating Clinton's sexual exploits, you realise how trivial it is for the mass murder of 3,000 people. For me, even though the 9/11 Commission report has been widely discredited, not least by those who are actually on the Commission, this entry on page 146 is enough to discredit the major findings of the Commission. They are only allowed to review the intelligence reports, and I quote from this page, they had no control over whether, when, or how questions of particular interest would be asked. Any intelligence officer will tell you that intelligence is the weakest of evidence. It's not under oath. It's often paid for, or under blackmail, or in this case extracted through torture. It's not reliable. Dozens of studies have shown that. These interrogations were critical in establishing if the alleged Al-Qaeda detainees had first-hand knowledge of the 9/11 plot, which is an essential part of the official narrative. In fact, 25% of the footnotes are references to these interrogations. And we know the interrogations were anything but sensitive, which is something they mentioned at the bottom there. Harsh is the euphemism I believe they used. On January the 2nd, 2008, the 9/11 Commission Chair Keane and the Vice Chair Hamilton published an article in the New York Times entitled "Stonewalled by the CIA," detailing how the CIA obstructed the investigation by not responding to lawful requests for information and later on destroyed videotapes of 200 hours of interrogations. It's not just the CIA. The FBI have been accused of aggressive deception. One thing that irritates me is that the FBI has gone beyond just covering up, trying to avoid disclosure, into what I call aggressive deception. That's former Senator Bob Graham, who was the co-chair of the 2002 Joint Congressional Inquiry into the terrorist attacks. He said those words in April this year. Incidentally, there is the matter of the 28 redacted pages of that very same congressional inquiry, where it's basically they've classified 28 pages, but there is a summary of the chapter that has been classified, where they state that there are specific sources, with plural, of foreign support for some of the September 11th hijackers whilst they were in the US. Now, I don't know whether it's going to expose, if it's ever released, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, I don't know. I don't know whether it's all part of the obfuscation and stuff that's going on with getting to the truth. What I do know is Obama promised pre-election to release these redacted pages to all the families. He still hasn't done it. I think he promised it twice. We've got NORAD, who lied to the 9/11 Commission. And this is from the senior counsel to the 9/11 Commission. At some level of government, at some point in time, there was an agreement not to tell the truth about what happened. I was shocked at how different the truth was from the way it was described. The tapes told a radically different story from what had been told to us and the public for 2 years. This is not spin, this is not true.
Sorry, Matt, what does NORAD stand for?
North
American.
Defence. Something, Regional Air Defence. The Thomas Keane, the 9/11 Chair Commission, said, "We to this day do not know why NORAD told us what they told us. It was just so far from the truth." And in the New York Times in August 2006, they reported that the 9/11 Commission held a secret meeting debating whether to refer the matter of NORAD lying to the Commission to the Justice Department for criminal investigation. And there's Max Cleland, who resigned as a 9/11 Commissioner. Get organised here. This is what he thought of some of the blatant obstructions. Thank you. A whitewash. Bush is scamming America. It's a scam. It's disgusting. It's obvious that the White House wants to run the clock out. We're told only a minority of the Commission members can see a minority of the documents, and then they have to clear what they're going to have to say with the White House. And finally, that's what we have here, an obstruction of a full investigation on the most serious attack on the homeland. I won't say any more about the report, as the lies, distortions and omissions are well documented elsewhere by David Ray Griffin and others. What do I think of it? There's a YouTube video of me burning this book outside the US Embassy in London. Let's look at the people who have been accused of carrying out the attacks of 9/11 and the evidence supporting that. Because that, for me, is a fundamental right that we have as family members. You know, people have been accused. Let's look at the evidence that's placing the blame on the perpetrators. On the 14th September 2001, the FBI released the names of 19 individuals who it identified as hijackers aboard the 4 airliners that crashed on September the 11th. 13 days later, in another press release, the FBI released 19 photographs, the ones you see there, of the individuals believed to be the hijackers of the 4 planes that crashed on September the 11th. Notice these individuals are no longer designated as identified, but merely believed to be the hijackers. They even added the following caveat to the press release. It should be noted that attempts to confirm the true identities of these individuals are still underway. There's been no subsequent press release confirming the true identities of these individuals. Has there been any justice? Have those who are responsible for the mass killings been identified and punished? The authorities would have us believe that those 19 young men, identified by just their name and photographs, have had their punishment, inasmuch as they were allegedly killed on the planes along with passengers and crew. Is there any authenticated evidence of them boarding the planes? I have submitted my own Freedom of Information application request to the FBI, identifying myself as a bereaved family member, asking for such evidence. And the FBI has failed to produce any authenticated evidence placing them on any of the flights involved in the attacks, and obviously in particular AA-11, which hit the North Tower. They cannot produce any authenticated flight manifests. Flight manifests are so fundamental. Anyone can buy a ticket and not fly. Anyone can buy a ticket, check in, and still not fly. Anyone can buy a ticket, check in, walk up to the gate, and still not fly. It's fundamental to do insurance claims, and it's a document that's accepted worldwide. They can't produce it. They can't produce CCTV stills or video, ticket stubs, and check-in staff testimony. When I've asked them, the FBI have come back with me with a variety of responses depending on how I've worded it. And I've got rather good at this because I've submitted lots and lots of Freedom of Information requests. One of the techniques they will do is that they will redirect me to the Zacharias Missouri trial. He was the so-called 20th hijacker. And as part of the prosecution's exhibits, there are 4 images purporting to be of Atta and Alomari at Portland Airport. That's not Boston Logan where AA-11 took off. That's all they can produce, and that's all that's been produced in a court of law. And they have a single video with no date, no timestamp, and no camera ID of the 5 alleged hijackers of AA-77 at Dulles Airport at an amazing 30 frames per second for a security camera. And bear in mind, this is 2001 we're talking about, where storage spaces, would have been a bit of an issue, still is today, I guess, to a certain extent. So it's 30 frames per second instead of a single frame per second, which was standard. The other thing is that this video was released by the Associated Press, not by the authorities. So it's not only evidence, it's authenticated evidence, it's authenticated by the issuer. The Missouri trial exhibits do not contain authenticated evidence of the perpetrators boarding the planes, let alone hijacking them. I've even contacted Sean Bentel, the Director of Customer Relations of American Airlines, and Douglas Parker, the CEO, to authenticate the copies of the AA-11 flight manifests which are floating around on the internet, issued by the Boston Globe and author Pete McDermott, and not by the airline or the FBI. Sean Bentel replied to my initial email, but will not authenticate them. I also contacted Kip Hamilton of American Airlines, who was interviewed on the 13th of September, and according to an FBI FD 302 form, which is a persons of interest interrogation or an interview record, this person, Kip, submitted a passenger list to the FBI printed out at 9:07 on September the 11th. None of them will authenticate the scanned images, nor provide authenticated copies. The Boston Globe has not replied to me when I asked them to release an authenticated copy of AA-11's flight manifest. But none of this really matters, because apparently, within hours of the attacks, the FBI had identified 19 probable hijackers, according to a statement by Robert Bonner to the 9/11 Commission. They have all the evidence, physical and digital. But the FBI have not produced any fundamental evidence, either in a court of law or by Freedom of Information request, that any of the 19 alleged hijackers had boarded the 4 aircraft and perpetrated the mass murder. As family members, we should have unfettered access to this most fundamental of evidence. And in the case of murder, it is up to the government to prove its accusations. A government that fails for 14 years to prove its accusations in a case of mass murder must be considered of covering up the crime. That's what I accuse the current administration under Obama of doing so in a recent letter. Anyway, over the last 2 years, I've been trying to get the British authorities to take an interest in the uninvestigated crime of the mass murder of 67 British people, not least the perpetrators. Here are 3 typical responses from the authorities. The first is from a Chief Inspector of West Sussex Police. She was visibly shocked when she was shown footage of Building 7 collapsing, which she hadn't heard of, and was even more surprised when I told her the investigators didn't test for explosives, or that evidence was removed from the crime scene almost immediately. However, she took the coward's way out by concluding, "I very much doubt that the fundamental issues that reported on that day could have been covered up, as you claim." She recommended I approach the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and my local MP, so I did. How anyone can stand by the 9/11 Commission report is beyond me. Why is a different question. I gave Genevieve a dozen or so reasons as to why she should question the veracity of the 9/11 Commission report. She stands by it. Has she even read it? I met with my local MP, Nick Herbert, and despite the MP, Michael Meacher, also speaking with him at length, face to face and over the phone on my behalf, Herbert has refused to take any of the actions I requested, including the easiest, in my opinion, public support petitioning the Attorney General to reopen my brother's inquest. Here's what he wrote. "Having given the matter considerable thought, I regret to say that I do not feel able to take any action. I appreciate that you will find this disappointing, but I am not convinced by the arguments against the 9/11 Commission report." That wasn't the only arguments I put forward. Herbert hasn't even got the decency to reply to my mother. She wrote to him in December last year asking for his support. We are both his constituents, and needless to say, we didn't vote for him on May the 7th. All that is necessary for the triumph of evil is that good men do nothing. Maybe I'm being too generous with that adjective. So, what am I up to? Well, there's quite a few different legal routes that I can take with my mum's blessing, because I'm obviously not next in kin, my brother. And before I talk about bits of that, I just wanted to say, just to clear up a bit of a misconception, my father and Jess' fiancée, Caroline, were co-signatories of the Victim Compensation Fund. At the time, I felt the US government had let it happen on purpose, but I wasn't aware of the acronym LIHOP. But after weighing up the pros and cons of going down the legal route in the US, we decided as a family to accept the VCF. This was one of the questions put to the lawyers providing pro bono assistance with the VCF fund. What rights to file a lawsuit will I be giving up if I choose to seek compensation from the VCF? They replied, under the fund, no one is prohibited from suing the terrorists. By filing a claim for compensation from the fund, claimants will be giving up their right to file a September 11th related lawsuit or be a party to a lawsuit against any party except any person who is a knowing participant in any conspiracy to hijack any aircraft or commit any terrorist act. Nothing, absolutely nothing, is preventing victim family members from going after the real perpetrators of the attacks. Some of the legal action I've been involved in, Andy mentioned it at the outset, involves the BBC, and I believe that the BBC are covering up 9/11. They reported the collapse of Building 7 some 23 minutes before its actual collapse and failed in their duty to report it to the authorities. Non-disclosure of foreknowledge of an act of terrorism is an offence under Section 38B of the Terrorism Act. Why hasn't the BBC informed the public about NIST's announcement of the free fall of Building 7, which proves controlled demolition? Why hasn't the BBC informed the public about the 118, now 156, on-record official eyewitness testimonies by frontline firefighters, first responders, stating that they heard or saw secondary explosions going off in all 3 towers. And for me, and this is just so obvious, why did the BBC edit out sounds of a huge explosion going off at Building 7 just before it collapsed, and then say there was no evidence of explosions? Why did they also edit out footage of a police officer asking the public to move it back? The building is about to blow up. So I stopped paying the TV licence, and basically when the chap turned up at my house in April last year, I actually cited the legislation. It's Section 15, Article 3, and Section 17 and Section 38B of the Terrorism Act, as I had reasonable cause to suspect I would be funding the purposes of terrorism. The farce of a trial was on the 23rd of March this year at Hastings Magistrates Court. The offence was ruled strict liability, which basically means there is no defence. I was not given a fair trial. I was not allowed to present evidence, call witnesses, a clear violation of Human Rights Article 6. I wasn't even allowed to read out my statement. I was gagged. I was found guilty and charged costs and fines of £395. I had an appeal at the Crown Court in Lewes on the 30th of April. God bless. And my fine was reduced by £7.50. Amazing. The case was clearly a conflict of law, and it still is. So even though I was found guilty, it doesn't alter the fact that I would be committing a serious crime if I were to purchase a TV licence. I would be happy to do so, provided no funds go to the BBC. So for now, I still don't have a TV licence. A question I put to the courts after the trial was, are Hastings Magistrates Court now instructing me to commit a serious crime? They declined to answer, saying it was inappropriate for them to comment. A fine passing sentence there. The other thing that we've had as a family, and not all of them, is an inquest. And on January 29th, 2013, there was an inquest held into the deaths of 10 of the 67 British victims, one of whom was my brother. The coroner relied heavily on the 9/11 Commission report. A report prepared by a counter-terrorism officer for the coroner for the inquest has been classified exempt from disclosure, which was admitted to me by a detective inspector after 6 months of going backwards and forwards between the Met and the coroner trying to get a copy. Remember paragraph 16 of the UN Principles? We are right of access to all information relevant to the investigation. That very same counter-terrorism officer, along with a Met police officer, visited me at my flat in February 2014 to discuss my concerns with the official narrative. For my protection and to impress upon them the seriousness of my concerns, I had an ex-counter-terrorism officer with me and a documentary filmmaker. The meeting went nowhere, and my many questions remain unanswered and redirected as a matter for the US authorities to answer. But as I said earlier, the FBI, the US Embassy and Obama won't address them. How do I get justice? Okay. So, the coroner concluded the following. At 8:46 a.m. on the 11th September 2001, the deceased was on the 106th floor of the North Tower of the World Trade Center when an aircraft, AA-11, was deliberately flown into the building, causing its collapse at 10:28 a.m. This event was part of a coordinated attack by the Islamist militant group Al-Qaeda. Let's go through the 3 assertions. Is there any evidence? The flight designated as American Airlines 11 has not been positively identified, i.e. serial numbers, to any wreckage found at the World Trade Center, despite landing gear allegedly being found at the corner of West and Rector Street, and despite freedom of information, and including my own freedom of information request submitted to the FBI. The FBI even admitted in court that it did not identify the wreckage of any aircraft involved in the attacks. The FBI owes me an explanation why it exceptionally decided not to conduct a proper forensic investigation into the identification of the wreckage of the flight designated as AA-11. Remember Lockerbie? Not only did they ID the single plane, they also tried to reconstruct it in a hangar. On 9/11, not only were there 4 planes, there were 2 at one site, and at one point there were reports of up to 12 flights being hijacked. critical that they do that standard forensic identification of planes. They failed to do that. Also rather troubling, the flight data recorders, which have been recovered from AA-77 and UA-93, for the first time in 20 years of a major investigation by the National Transport Safety Board, did not contain the serial numbers in the reports. What's going on? So the second assertion, that the impact of the plane causing its collapse at 10:28 of the tower. It has not been proven that AA-11 caused the collapse of World Trade Center 1. NIST, that's the National Institute of Standards and Technologies, were only tasked to investigate up to collapse initiation. No theory or model has been put forward by the authorities as to how or why the towers collapsed. It remains unexplained. The final assertion, I've already covered the lack of authenticated evidence and unreliable interrogation testimony establishing the myth of Al-Qaeda being behind the attacks. Nothing on my brother's inquest form is actually backed up with any evidence. And the other thing I find rather peculiar is actually what's on there is not, the statement, the conclusion they found there is not part of the 4 questions that a coroner is supposed to answer. It's like they wanted to stamp the official narrative on the conclusion. It's not part of the coroner's job. The other, I know it's a deja vu slide from one before, the other action I'm looking at is potentially suing the UK government for failing to provide an effective remedy into the gross violation of my brother's right to life, because they have failed to provide an effective investigation, relying instead on the US official narrative and failing to investigate the myriad of anomalies which present themselves against the official conspiracy hypothesis. The other action I'm investigating, and I'm in touch with lawyers in both the UK and the US, is introducing a legal complaint in the US. One UK family member, 2, but from one victim, supports what I'm doing. I went to the memorial this afternoon and I met up with another guy who also supports what I'm doing. So I know there's at least 3 family members who, even though they may not be all joining me in legal action, they at least support what I'm doing. The one thing about introducing a legal complaint in the US is it's not easy. It's going to take a very long time, it's going to be draining, it's going to use a hell of a lot of resources up. And the other thing that seems to happen is there's often either a conflict of interest, or everyone seems to encounter Judge Hellerstein in any 9/11 litigation action. Who knows, I might get lucky. He's 82 now. April Gallop, who I've met, she was a Pentagon employee who nearly died along with her 3-week-old son. In her legal action against the Bush administration, and in her appeal, encountered a first cousin of George Bush Sr. in the appeal. Now the appeal was dismissed as frivolous, and she was fined, or the prosecution, the legal counsel, were fined $15,000, and they're also hit with a sanctions order. Justice? And that's just a blatant conflict of interest. Knowing that Jeff had not survived the attacks when we returned to the UK from New York on the 21st of September, we held a memorial service for him on the 30th at a church in Northampton. The church was packed to overflowing and the BBC filmed the service. Tom Gloser, who was the then CEO of Reuters, and his wife attended. The piss-up in the evening at a friend's biker's pub was a typical heavy Campbell drinking affair. I still have one of the bottles of champagne stored at my house. If Jeff was still alive, it would have been one of the best school reunion and birthday parties he could have ever wished for. No one could believe that he was gone. But without any remains being identified, Jeff's DX certificate was issued on the 30th of October 2001. In the weeks and months after 9/11, we started to hear a strange term, vaporised, from the police family liaison officers assigned to us when they spoke about the chances of Jeff's remains being found and identified. At the time, we didn't really think about exactly what that meant. However, in June 2002, around my mother's birthday, we received a call from the police. Jeff's collarbone had been found and a new MX death certificate was issued in July 2002. there is his clavicle. Mum got a lot of comfort from the return of his collarbone because he broke it as a toddler. We didn't know what to do with it, so it stayed in my house in a casket given to us by the US funeral home that handled the transfer of remains. And then in July 2004 we had another call from the police. 3 more bone fragments had been identified. His scapula, sacrum and femur. All of these remains were recovered from the unfortunately named Freshkills landfill on Staten Island. We had them repatriated and we had a burial. I found it almost impossible to identify the bone fragments as once being my brother. And then in 2008 we had another call from the police to say further remains had been identified. These remains were actually the first to be recovered of Jeff on site in late September 2001. And for some reason they were not identified until 2008. Now when I asked the forensic anthropologists at the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner, or OCME, why that was, they said it could have either been down to contamination or the rather unpleasant idea of commingling of remains, i.e. other people being mixed in. That prevented whatever statistical threshold being reached to possibly ID these remains of those being Jeff's. And the second major tranche of retesting with improved DNA techniques obviously corrected this. Although we knew what was in the casket, nothing really prepared my mum and me when we opened the bags that the remains were sealed in. My mum let out an audible gasp when she opened her eyes. This was once her son. I'm a parent, I don't know how you handle this kind of thing. It was his scalp with hair, an ear, facial skin, some facial bones and his right jaw with some 3 teeth. My mother was relieved more than anything else that there was no sign of him being burnt. It was her biggest fear. So we had a second burial in 2008, and then out of the blue, in May 2013, we had yet another call from the police. Another part of Jeff's remains had been identified. This time it was his humerus, his upper arm. Now, these were the only remains that were actually tagged with the location when they were first recovered, and they were found approximately 20 to 40 metres south of the south side of the North Tower. Certainly not within the footprint of the building. And the humerus is the only remains that have not been repatriated. They are still in New York. Now, I visited the medical examiner, the OCME, in New York twice in the last 2 years. The first time was in December 2013, and although the OCME aren't really equipped to handle viewings, as you would with a funeral parlour, they allowed me in to view my brother's remains. Each of the remains is stored in a double-sealed, double-tagged bag, and when the inner seal is broken, you immediately smell a strange mix of preservative and remains halted in their decay. This particular remains are critical with some of my legal action going forwards. They're actually considered new evidence because they weren't referenced in the inquest in January of that year. And I've been speaking with Michael Meacher, who's been helping me, and he's had conversations with Dominic Grieve, who's the ex-Attorney General, and he said that these remains are enough to request a fresh inquest. So that is what I intend to do. Also, I've had some legal advice in that if I apply under Article 2 of the European Convention on Human Rights, it's like an enhanced inquest, there is an outside chance it could actually trigger a public inquiry into 9/11. I met again with the Chief Medical Examiner, Lead Forensics, in May 2014 as part of a Channel 5 documentary named somewhat disingenuously as The Last Secrets of 9/11. It was actually on TV last night on Channel 5. On May the 10th in 2014, early in the morning, the unidentified and identified but not claimed remains were transferred from the medical examiner's office down to the museum at World Trade Center, and the documentary filmmakers were covering it. Somehow I found myself at the corner of the World Trade Plaza along with a few other family members. Before I knew it, I was at the tail end of the procession, so this is actually my footage. For me, it was a kind of funeral procession to my brother's last resting place. A place where Jeff's fiancée Caroline could visit. 14 years on, and she is not doing well. Over the years, we discovered that we have both spent too many late nights endlessly searching for photos, audio, videos of his last whereabouts on the day. I can't tell you the amount of times I've looked at all the footage of people hanging out the windows and the jumpers, trying to see if it was my brother. She has still not found the strength to go down to World Trade Center, even though she only lives a dozen blocks away. Now, the media would have you believe that the remains in those caskets, all the remains in those 3 caskets straight with the US flag, were being transported to the museum. It's not the case. There was only a tiny representative sample in each casket. They had transferred the remains in secret several hours earlier. God bless the media. Oops. For us as a family, 9/11 is never going to go away, obvious reasons. There are also references to it almost daily in the media and popular culture. And the efforts to identify victims of the World Trade Center remains will continue for the foreseeable future. The Chief Medical Examiner, Deputy Director of Forensic Investigations, told me this a few days ago. Now these are the World Trade Center statistics as of August this year. As you can see, I don't know if you can see the small print there, of 21,906 body parts, 35% of those remains are still unidentified. A staggering 1,113, that's 40% of the people who were reported missing at World Trade have had no remains identified, nothing. Over the past 2.5 years, there have only been 5 new identifications. They are still identifying remains at a rate of 30 to 50 per month, but these are further remains of people already identified. I was surprised to learn that Jeff's multiple identification remains is actually the most common, most fall in the categories of none or 5 upwards. During my visit with the OCME, I learned one more disturbing fact, that they have nearly 100 unidentified and unclaimed bodies with strong DNA profiles. Some are nearly complete bodies, that's up to 90%. Now a few can be accounted for because of religious reasons. Some families have not provided DNA samples. But the bulk are probably the large number of homeless that lived in the disused subway tunnels and substructures of the World Trade Center. Who speaks for them? Let's go back to this term vaporisation, which the police started using with us in the weeks and months after 9/11. Let's look at some of the numbers. Sorry, that is rather small. So there's 2,753 people reported missing at World Trade Center. 1,637 have been identified, 89% by DNA. Only 1%, just 15 people, are identified by viewing remains. 40% have not been identified, so in that sense, people were vaporised. Now, at the joint inquest held into my brother's murder, along with 9 other victims, whose remains had been found, I discovered 4 of them were on the 106th floor of the North Tower at the Risk Waters Conference. Let's have a look at some of the information from there. So, okay, out of the 10 victims, 8 were employees, and 2 were attendees. If we look at this table, so 6 people, there's been nothing found at all. You've got 3 people who had approximately 2 to 3% identified. Now, one of those is my brother. And one of those people actually had almost identical remains to my brother. Just the scalp, a bit of their head, and a few bone fragments. But then, most interestingly, one person who was an employee was found nearly 86 to 87% of his body intact. Bear in mind, these are all on the same floor, 106th floor. What can cause this range of percentage of remains from the same floor? Proximity to explosives, perhaps? Oops, sorry. Now, like I said, we only had, out of all the remains that have been identified by my brother, we only had one that was actually tagged with the location. Now, and it was done by the grid was the fire department of New York had created a grid structure, and when remains were found and they had the presence of mind or the gadget to record it, they made a log of where the remains were found. And this was part of a large freedom of information request. I don't know who did it. I do actually have a spreadsheet of this, but this shows you the distribution of remains. And that's quite spread out. Some of them are almost a fifth of a mile away from the towers. Bearing in mind we're told it's a fire-driven gravitational collapse. That's a hell of a distance. Okay, oops, let's come out the wrong way. Okay, so I'm going to talk about why I've gone public. I've spent years going around in circles on the internet, delving into 9/11. I first started questioning the official narrative when a friend of mine, who's here tonight, forwarded me an article by John Pilger entitled "This War is a Farce." The war on terrorism is a fraud. After 3 weeks bombing, not a single terrorist implicating the attacks in America has been caught or killed in Afghanistan. I then started to read outside the mainstream media. Rupert, Griffin, Ahmed, even stuff by Chomsky. I didn't go down too well working in the city. The Chomsky book, and like that. My wife used to say to me, what's the point of knowing this stuff? What are you going to do about it? It was actually Tony Rook who inspired me to take action. He was the first person, to my knowledge, who took on the BBC in the same way that I tried to, citing the terrorism legislation as reasons not to fund the TV licence, the BBC. I met him at his BBC court case. It was in Horsham, just up the road, so I have no excuse not to go, in February 2013. I was actually lucky enough to sit in on the actual trial because it was packed, and he obviously cited the terrorism legislation. Now, critically for me, when I had my court case, I had just 3 magistrates, and they're not even legally trained, only the clerk of the court is, and they admitted that at the outset of the trial they hadn't looked at any of the evidence that I'd submitted. Now, Tony Rook had a district judge sitting on the trial. I did actually request a district myself, but they refused. Tony was lucky enough, and so the judge had actually seen all his evidence pre-trial. And, I'm pretty sure that had a bearing on the case. They gave him a conditional discharge and no fine. Bear in mind, this guy hadn't had a licence for years and years and years. No fine, conditional discharge. That's why I think some alternative media, dubbed it as a moral victory. And because of the matter of strict liability which still applied, there was no way he could win. Tony only had to pay the prosecutor's costs. I also know that the prosecutor actually tipped in a couple of quid to pay for his own costs because there was a collection pot going around in the pub. It was good to meet people who weren't afraid of making a stand, and of course who didn't believe the official conspiracy theory. Right, why has it taken me so long to speak out? Well, 2013 was the end of a decade-long depression for me, which thankfully left me in May 2013. And along with a growing awareness of what our governments and intelligence agencies are capable of planning and executing, i.e. Operation Northwoods and Gladio, and the work of A&E 9/11 Truth specifically on Building 7. And after meeting Tony, I just felt I couldn't stay silent anymore. Now I want to briefly look at Northwoods, Building 7, and the NIST reports. That's the National Institute of Standards and Technologies. And I also want to look a bit more in detail at the actual hijacks themselves. So, Operation Northwoods. In 1962, the chairman, Lemnitzer, of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, brought President Kennedy a plan called Operation Northwoods. Now, this was released under a Freedom of Information Act request in 2000. It described pretexts which would provide justification for US military intervention in Cuba. The plan listed a series of possible actions. Here are a couple. We could develop a communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area, in other Florida cities, and even in Washington. We could sink a boatload of Cubans en route to Florida, real or simulated. And it is possible to create an incident which will demonstrate convincingly that a Cuban aircraft has attacked and shot down a chartered civil airliner. The passengers could be a group of college students off on holiday. Now, JFK vetoed the plan, but other covert strategies of tension, i.e. Operation Gladio, have been carried out, which include false flag terrorism, of which I believe 9/11 was. And let's be clear here, everyone signed this off, except JFK. So it wasn't like some little chap trying to jump the career progression path in the military. This was signed off by all the top brass in the States as a bona fide plan to put forward to JFK to create a pretext for war in Cuba. Judge Ferdinand Impossimato, the honorary president of the Italian Supreme Court, has stated publicly that 9/11 was a false flag operation, recommending that it be tried at the International Criminal Court, which was set up to protect the world from criminal acts of war. Now, Impossimato has presided over several terrorism-related cases, including the kidnapping and assassination of President Aldo Moro and the attempted assassination of Pope John Paul II. He was also a legal consultant to the United Nations and presidential candidate in Italy this year. The Mossad were involved. This is what Impossimato has said, that the Mossad were involved. That's the Secret Service of Israel. Were involved in the assassination of Aldo Moro. They infiltrated, funded, trained, and equipped the Red Brigade from the outset. This stuff's real. Right, I want to look briefly at the collapse of Building 7. So, Building 7 was the third tower that collapsed on 9/11. In addition to the Solomon Brothers, it also housed nearly all the US government's alphabet agencies. It was not hit by a plane and had fires on just 6 of the 47 floors. It suffered some structural damage to the south and southwest side, caused by falling debris of the North Tower. Now, it collapsed symmetrically in its own footprint in less than 7 seconds, some 7 hours after the North Tower. And most interestingly, 23 minutes after the BBC had announced it had already collapsed. But it wasn't just the BBC. CNN actually announced that a 50-storey building had collapsed. In a report they gave at 11:10 that morning, they said it had collapsed at 10:45. And for me, this is certainly scripted. You could argue that there were rumours of collapse, possibly right late afternoon, but you just had Tower 1 collapse, and you've got a radio report basically saying that 15 minutes after that, a 50-storey building had collapsed, and it's the only building of that size that obviously had any danger of collapse in that area. Now, at a public meeting in 2008, given by NIST, where they talked about their draft report into the collapse of Building 7, and so I should say, Building 7, a 47-storey building, at the time it would have been the third biggest building in this country. Now, it was kind of dwarfed by the towers, but it was a huge building. It's still been the top 10 in this country. At this public meeting, their draft report, the lead investigator, Sunder, when questioned why NIST had not recognised the easily measurable freefall of Building 7, and instead highlighted that the total collapse time was 40% slower than freefall, he actually replied that it would mean it would have no structural components below it. Now, in their final report in November that year, NIST reluctantly admitted the freefall acceleration for at least 2.25 seconds, but did not elaborate on it, apart from saying the buckled columns, you can see in the small print there, provided negligible support. And I haven't got my keys, but for those of you who don't know what freefall is, it's just that. It's like something dropping with absolutely nothing underneath it. And in fact, all of the towers fell through what should have been the path of most resistance, to a certain extent at speeds that are very hard to believe. And Let's look at other World Trade Center buildings which were hit by debris. Some with fires on every floor and some completely burnt out. Let's see what happened to them. World Trade Center 3, still standing. World Trade Center 4, still standing. World Trade Center 5, still standing. World Trade Center 6, still standing. So I finally started taking public action in June 2013. One of the very first things I did was I took a trip down to Chichester Police Station to report a crime, and that was when I met with the Chief Inspector, who hadn't heard of Building 7, let alone see it. Since then I've been relentlessly haranguing the police, that's local and the Met, politicians, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, the US Ambassador, NIST, universities, Cameron Science Council, the FBI, structural engineers, the Royal Institute of British Architects, etc., etc. And I've started various legal actions and doing outreach stuff like this and debates. All stuff I'm not particularly comfortable with, but it's important to do. And as bereaved family members, I think it's the most important thing we can do is actually join forces and demand justice for the mass murders of 9/11. That's what I'm trying to do. And like I said, there's 3 of us now in this country, and I'm hoping that number can only but grow. Right, what I want to look at is NIST. Like I said, I've done an awful lot of freedom of information requests. I've also been in email contact with all the major authors of the NIST reports, as well as the, I call him the FAQ, frequently asked questions gatekeeper, Michael someone. Now this is from one of the official documents, the report into the collapse of the Twin Towers. This for references NC*11, Chapter 2, Figure 2.4, which purports to show a typical World Trade Center tower architectural floor plan. In the core section, this plan indicates, I don't know if you can make it out there, 1 elevator, 1 stair, 1 closet, 1 storage, and it especially emphasises the air supply and return shafts by indicating them twice. It makes people think that the core section is empty, it bore nothing. I mean, I'd almost go as far as to say the huge, massive core columns are almost practically invisible on that plan. The report of the National Commission will even argue in the first note in Chapter 9, and I quote, "These exterior walls bore most of the weight of the building. The interior core of the buildings was a hollow steel shaft in which elevators and stairwells were grouped." That implies the core columns supported almost nothing. This figure also shows the exterior columns. They look important. They look like they fill the complete perimeter distance by a steel frame. The remaining empty space between the 2 columns is smaller than the actual filled steel area. I'll explain this a bit more in the next few slides. The exterior columns were box columns. Now, this is a common engineering technique. Columns are hollow and yet retain the majority of their strength, but at a fraction of the cost and weight of the solid steel. High-rise buildings are all about efficiency and handling lateral forces and forces from earthquakes. Now, the steel of the box columns was as thin, so bad, as a 1/4 inch to the outer web flanges. I haven't got a pointer. Do you want one? Have you got? Yeah. I'll have a water. Yeah, I always wanted to use one of these. How do I get it? Oh, right, okay. So, it was as thin as a 1/4 inch on the outer web flanges, and at the top of the tower. Sorry, let me start this again. Okay, it was as thin as a 1/4 inch here on the outer web and the 2 flanges at the top of the towers. And as you went further down, it increased to 7/8 of an inch, not even an inch thick, and 2.5 inches for the flanges. At the impact areas for both towers, it was probably only about 1/2 an inch at the impact areas. In figure 2.7 of the same chapter of the report, the dimensions of these exterior columns are shown. Now these are 14 inches wide, and the distance between the 2 columns is 40 inches. That means that the steel space filled approximately 14/40, about a third of the space, and the empty space was 26 inches over 40, which is approximately 2/3. Now this is not consistent with the architectural plan of figure 2.4, the slide I've just shown you, and I'll zoom in on that in a second, where they've got the steel distance is bigger than the empty distance. I'm just going to point the empty distance again, it's there. Even accounting for the insulation and thin aluminium cladding, there is something false in this plan. The exterior perimeter columns were increased in size before publishing it. So this is done through CAD, computer-aided design. This is all scaled. The image here is an increased scaled image of the columns from figure 2.4. The scale basis is 40 inches between the two columns. And at this scale, you can actually see that the width of the columns is shown as 24 inches. That's an additional 5 inches on each side. And so when you see the floor plan, it looks like a continuous steel frame. It's clearly visible that this architectural plan was faked by adding a second square around all perimeter columns to make them look bigger than they really are. And this is fakery contained in an official report. And for me, you know, that if we can't trust the size of columns, then we can trust hardly anything inside this report. All evidence that they put forward could be wrong. We also know from the work of A&E 9/11 Truth, via the prolific 9/11 researcher David Cole, who I'm in contact with, through all his Freedom of Information requests, that NIST omitted critical flange stiffeners from drawings of column 79 in their final report into the collapse of Building 7. Now these flanges would have actually prevented the bottom flange from folding, which was required for NIST's explanation of how the building collapsed. They actually omitted key components in the drawings. Incidentally, NIST won't release the data inputs, it's on that 9/11 conspiracy thing we saw at the start, of their model of the collapse of Building 7 because it may jeopardise public safety, which is ridiculous. I mean, structural engineers need to know everything about the building, everything about the model to then help design safer buildings. It's just a ridiculous statement. So what did the 9/11 Commission report say again? They said that the interior core of the buildings was a hollow steel shaft in which elevators and stairwells were grouped. Got my gadget again. Compare the size of the interior columns with the perimeter columns. These core columns were 5 to 6 inches thick at the base. Remember, no core columns remained standing after the collapse of the towers. The iconic images that you see are actually the exterior columns. Now, I've written to the authors of all the reports, and they won't answer my questions. And this FAQ gatekeeper kept me happy for a few replies, but when I started asking more pertinent questions, he resorted to a cut and paste of "we stand by the thorough investigation, blah, blah, blah." I asked him about the falsification of the perimeter columns. I asked them why they view the floor trusses as critical steel components, in reference to fireproofing. And most bizarrely is they state that you can infer that the integrity of the building actually relied on 2 5/8 of an inch bolts, which apparently were all that was holding the floor trusses, the perimeter columns. It's ludicrous. But my thing within the reports is all they reinforced was the importance of the perimeter columns and the importance of the floor trusses. They completely ignore the core. If you actually have looked at a word count of the core versus description of the perimeter, it's a tiny fraction. They just ignored it. Now, like I said, I make my own Freedom of Information requests. That's been important for me to do so. It's been a good learning process for me. I've learned there are different ways. Some are more effective than others at making these requests. Because it's not easy. The modus operandi of government bodies is to make things as hard as possible to obtain information, hoping that you'll give up. What I've learned is you have to be very, very specific. So ideally, if you can obtain an index of file names at first, it makes it easier because you can then request specific file names. Now, I made these requests for these files, very, very specifically named files, 7 months ago. They told me at the end of May that they were finalising the release process. And they've been fobbing me off ever since. And I do know, because as you said, speaking with David Cole and seeing what's else on the internet, that a lot of the information you try to get out of the authorities, you actually have to go down the legal route to force them to hand it over, which is a ridiculous situation, not least because I'm a family member. So, why are these important? Well, sorry, and the other thing I'd add to that is, if they don't release them, then something's definitely up, and I'll have to go down the legal route. If they only give me a partial release, it's telling me that there's something there that they don't want people to discover. Because obviously, once I do get it, I will make it public. Anyway, why are these important? Well, along with an engineer who is helping me, I believe that the massive core was diagonally braced to bear lateral forces. Now NIST, in all their reports, say the lateral forces were borne by the external columns, and they have only released floor plans and exterior plans. There's no side elevations of the core. There's no bracing schedule, which is one of those that I've requested, and there's certainly no original drawings which are in what's called Drawing Book 6. Ask any structural engineer which plans are the first ones to look at. It's not the floor plans, it's the structural engineering of the core. And NIST have admitted that below floor 7 and on the 2 mechanical floors and on the hat truss the core was braced, but nowhere else. I don't believe them. The deceptive language used throughout the NIST report, and especially in the executive summaries, is subtle. They're hoping experts and lay people will just read them, it sounds reasonable, and then move on. So, for example, they change the, I'll whiz back to the picture, the thin spandrel plates become deep spandrel beams. Now, not for love nor money is that a beam, it's a plate. And a deep beam, I can't really illustrate it, would normally be, you see some buildings where in the Twin Towers the windows were quite high. Okay, they were skinny because I think the guy had vertigo or something, but they were very high. So the beams, the plates weren't that deep, i.e. they didn't reduce the windows to that size. Yeah, and that's important for me when speaking with this engineer to understand. I said other things in the report that the box columns were connected to the floor panels via the 2 5/8 of an inch bolts, and also here the splice plates. You've got lateral bolts, so you've got effectively bolts. This is the side of the building. You've got bolts going through them laterally, not this way. Yeah. So for me, for the exterior columns to be stiff enough to bear the lateral forces is laughable. I mean, it really is. More likely, the exterior columns transferred the forces, which is very common in lots of tall buildings, via the 4-inch concrete slabs, because concrete's very good in compression. So you have a force against the wall, it gets transferred to the very, very strong in compression concrete, and gets transferred to the interior core. Anyway, why does this issue of lateral forces matter, and why am I boring you with all these details? Leaving aside the matter of falsifying drawings and official reports and the key emissions, it would make the official story of the inward bowing of the external perimeter, which is basically called, they say the floor trusses expanded and they contracted when they cooled, and these 2-inch bolts pulled in on the external perimeter. Now, even if I believe that, I would expect the perimeter just to peel away, worst case, or bits of it to peel away. I wouldn't expect the equivalent 2-inch bolts on the other side to actually bring down the massively diagonally braced interior core. Interestingly enough, and NIST report it in their FAQ, but also there's some photographs up in Aman Zafar. It's got some of the best images, high-res images of the collapse of the tower. That's AMAN Zafar, ZAFAR.com. You can see that 15 to 25 seconds after the collapse, 60 to 40 stories of the core of both the North Tower and the South Tower still remain standing. So you've got these huge core structures still standing. All the floors are gone, all the perimeter's gone, and they're standing for 15 to 25 minutes, and then they eventually go. That weight's not there anymore. All that stuff that they've been having to bear is no longer there, but they still collapsed. Anyway, I mean, I'm waiting for the release of the Freedom of Information to see if they satisfy my request. I won't hold my breath. I've got a feeling it will be a long time before they release it. Right, the other thing I wanted to talk about was the hijacks. Because notwithstanding the evidence, the absence of evidence, I should say, of the perpetrators boarding the planes, I simply do not believe that the hijacks of 9/11 were carried out by 4 individual teams of wannabe jihadists, double agents, patsies, whoever they were. Because, in any case, each of the alleged hijackers were terrible pilots by all accounts, and plenty of experienced pilots have come forward to say that there's no way they flew the planes on 9/11. That's not really something I want to focus on here. From my research, all evidence actually points towards the planes being controlled by one team remotely, a single team who managed each hijack in a controlled, and this is key, sequential manner, and I'll show you what I mean. This incidentally is taken from the FBI's website, and I think it's in that video as well at the start of the crazy flight paths each of the planes apparently took. So the first thing to look at is actually a timeline of the hijacks. So what do we know with any real certainty? Well, we know the takeoff times, we know the deviation times, that's either through communication or an actual operational deviation from the routes, and we also know the impact times. Very hard to actually get that information. I think all the different FAA, NORAD, 9/11 Commission actually give different versions of timings, which is incredible. But here we have some information there. Let's go back to the map. So if you've got 4 teams of terrorists hijacking the planes, you've got each team managing their own plane. You presume they won't be able to communicate with their buddies. And the airports from which the planes took off are all on the East Coast. And their targets, of the 3 that we know about, are also near the East Coast. So you would expect that each team would hijack the plane pretty much as soon as possible and fly each one to their own target. Incidentally, all the planes took off, or were scheduled to take off, fairly close together, within 25 minutes of each other. So, I mean, I've really only focused on AA11, but I obviously have looked at the other flights. So, let's look what happened with the first hijacked plane. Now, AA11, the one that hit my tower, my brother was in, 15 minutes after takeoff, we had the following exchange with the air traffic controller, Pete Zalewski, who had just taken the handoff of AA11 as it entered Sector 46, which is Boston High. So, 46R is the air traffic controller, and he's saying AA11 turn 20 degrees right. 2 seconds later, you have the pilot confirming AA11 20 right. And then just 16 seconds later, there's another request, which is the Pete Zalewski's requesting the plane to climb and maintain 35,000 feet. To which there was no response from either of the 2 pilots. Bear in mind, all these planes had 2 pilots on them. And none of those pilots, and in particular obviously on the flight we're looking at here, triggered the 7500 hijack code, and none of the other 6 pilots did. Now I have obtained, through another free information request, the FAA audio file of the interview of the air traffic controller Zalewski, who was dealing with AA11. And I actually paid a company to get the audio file transcribed. It was really hard to understand what they were saying. Now, Zalewski wasn't questioned about failing to follow standard operating protocols. He did offer that he asked AA11 to turn 20 degrees right to expedite normal separation from a plane. It was a Delta Airlines 1149, which apparently was heading south from Manchester, Boston to Atlanta. I have not obtained the radar data for Dallas, the flight to confirm this. I do know from the BTS database that there was a flight which took off at 7:54. Now this is what Pete Zalewski said in his interview. So then I turned the American 20 degrees right to get the separation to happen fast. I could have waited until they pass and then climb, but being the good air controlled traffic, the I am. I said I will turn him in and to expeditiously climb and on his way. So he turned him 20 degrees right, to which he responded to. And yes, I was surprised when I looked at the timeline, when you look at the transcript, that it was right fairly soon. Now, not only was Zalewski in charge of AA11, who did not follow protocols when the transponder went off at 8, 12 and 52 seconds. That's from another free information request that I made. Someone made on my behalf. It did not get turned off at 8:21, which is what the 9/11 Commission report reports. It states on page 18. So you've got the transponder going off. I've actually got the data file. You see the last entry that was triggered. It has like coordinates and the ID of the plane. And so within 60 seconds, you've got the crew not responding, and obviously after this 16 seconds from the last instruction. Now, Zalewski tried to contact the pilots for 10 minutes, including on emergency channels, before escalating it at 8:25. But NORAD weren't informed until 8:37. There's obviously 24 minutes of crucial time. Now, for me, I'm pissed off that the 9/11 Commission puts the transponder off at 8:21. You could just read that quickly and go, 4 minutes, he escalated, it's all okay, yeah? Even though there was some doubt about not contacting them. So you've got not only the transponder going off, nearly 13 minutes beforehand, you also got non-contact with the pilots. Just not following protocol. The other thing that's interesting to note is Ben Sliney, who's the National Operation Manager at the FAA Command, stated that notifying NORAD is routine protocol. It's been in place since 1964. They waited 23 minutes. And that pisses me off because that's 23 minutes where potentially that plane could have been intercepted and my brother wouldn't be dead. Right. So, according to, and that's a small, tiny L there, according to a German documentary called 9/11 False Flag, Zalewski was also in charge of 175, United Airlines 175, and Egypt Air 990. Now, that was a 767 which crashed full of Egyptian military types 2 years earlier. And the reason I'm putting this forward is the first officer, a Muslim, committed murder-suicide on that plane, muttering, "I rely on God," 8 times. Now, I've actually read the NTSB, that's National Transport something board, I can't remember what it stands for, and the Egyptian Civil Aviation Authority reports into the crash of Egyptian Air 990, which incidentally, which I find interesting, documents how the FAA and the NTSB did not cooperate fully with the Egyptian Civil Aviation Authority regarding all information and data on the air traffic controllers. And unfortunately, the reports do not name the controllers. I do not categorically know that Zalewski was one of the controllers. All I have is the documentary to state that. I know, from going through it, that one is a female in region 86, another is a male in region 66. Anyway, for me, Pete Zalewski is a person of interest in an area of research I think it's worth looking into. And in particular the plane that allegedly was heading south that forced him to do the... he came up with the idea of saying go right 20 degrees. Anyway, so the first plane, AA11, deviated 15 minutes after takeoff. And bear in mind, they took off from the East Coast, the targets are on the East Coast, yeah? And for me, there's no reason why those individual hijackers, if they really were there, wouldn't do something similar for each. Especially as once the first hijack starts, the risk of being intercepted would increase. So I would say, let's just say each plane should deviate between 10 and 20 minutes after takeoff. 1 or 2 minutes difference doesn't really matter, but the probable graphic of the hijack timeline would look something like this. So you've got this obviously standing in the airport. This is, you've taken off, and after a certain period of time, in this case it's 15 minutes, you are basically, the flight's been deviated, you've hijacked the plane. Look at UA175, you do a similar sort of time, 10, 15, 20 minutes, to hijack the plane to its target, and these are all calculated on the distance it would have had to fly if you intercepted it at that point. And the key thing here is, it should all be over by 9:10, and I'll explain what this is in a second. that's what you would expect. You know, your 4 individual teams, we've got to do it quickly. As soon as the first one gets hijacked, there is a chance our whole gig's going to get blown. So instead of that, we have them carrying on for nearly another hour. So instead of 10 or 20 minutes between each takeoff and deviation hijack, the actual times between takeoff and deviation are 15 minutes, 28 minutes, 34 minutes, and a staggering 53 minutes with UA-93. Nothing is similar across all 4 planes. I don't think that's consistent with a 4-team operation acting independently. And critically for me, the last flight was delayed by 41 minutes after taxiing. And I think it's important just to have a look at. So if there really were terrorists, the people who allegedly murdered my brother inside the planes, in particular on A11, you would have thought on UA-93, when they finally get in the air, they'd be going, you know, shit, we're really late, our colleagues have probably already finished their work, we've got to hijack as soon as we can, possibly even abort, but really you just want to hijack it quickly. So instead, they wait the longest period of time, 53 minutes after takeoff, much longer than anyone else. And this deviation happened at 9:35, 3 minutes before the Pentagon impact at 9:38. If you analyse the gaps, and I said you have to be a bit careful with the numbers, but the gaps between each time and the next deviation or hijack is 3 minutes, 9 minutes, or 4 minutes. That to me is a very neat overlap. If you look at the red bars, it almost looks like continuous work, like it's in a sequence. Now, I believe the hijacks were controlled remotely by a single team, and they used a technology that can guide itself autonomously to its target on the basis of the GPS coordinates, which would explain why the last few minutes, you've set it on its course, you can start the next hijack. After each impact. Anyway, I'm not going to go on about that anymore. I've got a few more slides there, but I'll leave that. Because it is very hot, and I know I've been talking for a long time. Tony Rook, I mentioned earlier. He calls himself a British filmmaker. It's one of the many things he does. He's a 9/11 activist as well. But he approached me at the same time when I went to Chichester Police Station to take part in a documentary that I think is a first crowdfunding project. And critically, it focuses on police officers, firefighters, and politicians who have all voiced their grave concerns over the official version of events. The actual film, it's been 2 years in the making, it's specifically aimed at serving police, firemen, and army. He's not really targeting the public. I mean, I'm sure people will watch it, but that's not his goal. I'm in it, my mum's in it, and Jeff's fiance's in it. My dad, he's more interested in the first part of my presentation, in the absence of evidence, and he doesn't believe, and he's a retired architect, that the towers came down because of fire. The film has some powerful interviews in it. Cynthia McKinney, Judge Impossimato, and there are ex-police and ex-counter-terrorism officers, along with ex-military and firemen, one of whom, brave lad, is actually still serving. We need more of those people still in the system, particularly with the police. And is hoping to do a screening in London. It will probably be middle of October, not early October now. Michael Culver, who some of you may recognise that name, I know he's active in Stop the War efforts. He's perhaps best known as Captain Needa in The Empire Strikes Back. He's done the narration for the film. So, a few more things to look at. How are we doing for time?
You're okay, you've got 20 minutes here.
Yeah. Okay, I just want to briefly look at what's called Project for New American Century, or PNAC. Now, this was a neoconservative think tank founded in 1997, and in September 2000, a document, which was really a blueprint for Pax Americana, was written, titled Rebuilding America's Defences, Strategies, Forces and Resources for a New Century. And this is taken from a newspaper article written by John Pilger. And the document of rebuilding America's defences basically said that to bring about the change, the huge investment that they need, and to achieve the goals, they needed some catastrophic and catalysing event, like a new Pearl Harbor. The report calls itself a blueprint for maintaining global US preeminence, precluding the rise of a great power rival and shaping the international security order in line with American principles and interests. Pilger went on to say, or to point out, that of the 25 signatories to the founding principles of PNAC, 10 went on to take very senior positions in the Bush administration and military. And within 12 months they had their new Pearl Harbor. I think there's some motive there. Interesting enough, he wrote that on my brother's birthday in 2002. He went on, in the Los Angeles Times, the military analyst William Arkin describes a secret army set up by Donald Rumsfeld, similar to those run by Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, which Congress outlawed. This, I quote, super intelligence support activity will bring together the CIA, military, covert action, information warfare, and deception. And Pilger goes on. This is reminiscent of Operation Northwoods. Now Rumsfeld has resurrected Northwoods, but with the resources undreamt of in 1963, or 1962, and with no global rival to invite caution. He goes on. You have to keep reminding yourself this is not fantasy, that truly dangerous men such as Pearl and Rumsfeld and Cheney have power. I have never known official lying to be more pervasive than it is today. Okay, so 2 more slides. This is going to be a fun one. Now, I did say, whether people believe the official conspiracy theory or you subscribe to a particular counter theory. For me, ultimately, who killed my brother is important. The exact method, how, is secondary, but obviously it's still important, certainly to bring it back in a court of law. But I'm focused on the truth for justice sake, and justice sake only. It doesn't interest me a lot of the stuff that's out there. And so I'm going to go over a few. These are just my thoughts. And if, and it's a high probability if, 9/11 was an inside job, and by inside job I mean a Mossad, CIA, probably MI6 operation with some help from their PNAC friends, then the cover-up needs to be maintained for as long as it is deemed necessary. So infiltrating truth movements, including from the outset, as ex-Obama administration staffer Cass Sunstein recommends, is mandatory. Look at the FBI's track record of COINTELPRO in the 1960s with the Black Panthers. And it is my belief that almost all of the major 9/11 truth groups have been infiltrated. It would make sense. And, I still speak with a lot of people, and, I don't wish to offend them, but I really don't trust anyone on the matter of my brother's murder. Apart from a polymath friend who I've known for over 20 years, an engineer who left Scholars for 9/11 Truth because of the blatant disinfo that was being kicked around, and the fact that he consistently focused on truth for justice purposes only. And a friend of mine from a class at school when I was aged 11 at secondary school. Now, although I'm rusty, I do have a degree in theoretical physics and a master's in non-linear mathematics, which helps me separate the wheat from the chaff, particularly on some of the technical aspects. Now, I do not know for sure whether the following people are disinfo, sloppy, or simply delusional. But I've had all sorts of people contact me when I went public, mostly supportive, but I also had a torrent of abuse, particularly from the idiots at September Clues and Let's Roll forums. It was absolutely surreal. They accused me of being a government agent, that my brother didn't exist or die, and that his image was computer generated. Jim Fetzer also accused me of the same in a bizarre email thread, which had a lot of people connected in the various 9/11 truth groups. I was questioning him about his no planes, his mini nukes. In that same thread, I was also questioning architects and engineers about thermite. But the response from Fetzer was truly staggering. He basically said, that he doesn't believe that my brother died and that I'm an agent, etc., etc. And this was a year on from when I had the most bizarre email with him about his approach to logic and how to get truth from my brother. I've had the directed energy weapons people shouting abuse at me, saying that I'm preventing free energy being provided for humanity. I mean, I kid you not. I mean, it's and this is 1 or 2 emails in, so it's nice and introductory and then boom. And for me personally, particularly because of I only interacted once on forums online. My interactions with the September Clues people and the Let's Roll forum people, I believe video fakery, I mean, because it's so closely linked to No Planes, it's all disinfo. I'll go into that in a little bit. But let's just look at some of the founders. I'll list some of the people. But I said it's, for me, you can't truly know whether someone's a disinfo, just like that Fetzer doesn't know my world. But I can look at what they're putting forward as a theory. So let's look at some of the founders of the major 9/11 truth groups. So let me just list these people first of all. And this might offend some people in the room. So Simon Schack, Ace Baker, Phil Jahan, they're all the September Clues Let's Roll forums, and it's absolutely disgusting what they've got up there. They basically delve into every single victim's personal life and just go into it, and with some pathetic, this is a fake picture, they go into their private lives, their business, their friends, everything. It's just, yeah, anyway. The No Planers, said Fetzer's supporter, Morgan Reynolds, John Lear. For me, again, talking about groups being infiltrated, and I said, I don't know if this is making people uncomfortable in the room because you might subscribe to this stuff. I mean, he was one of the co-founders of Pilots for 9/11 Truth, which I think almost certainly, if you look at the threads there, there are people there causing trouble. And Richard D. Hall's an English guy, I believe. And then there's the Jew, the mini nukes, and the missiles. Obviously not everyone is disinfo, but it only needs 1 or 2 influential, persuasive types to garner followers. And unfortunately, the mainstream media will amplify the least credible theories and the most offensive theories. And all counter theories are suddenly tarred with the same brush. For me, I'm trying to get justice for my brother. I'm trying to get to the truth. And it just infuriates me, the way that stuff is put up. And not people who are following us, but the actual leaders of those groups, they need to confront what they're putting forwards and, withdraw it. If it's either, well, for me, if it's weak, it's not being used. So I can guarantee you that none of the stuff that's on there is going anywhere near a court of law in my actions to get justice for my brother. Not a chance. So, I mean, for me, I've read an awful lot. At one point, I think I had over 150 books, and I was living in Thailand for 6 years with my family. And, oddly, I just dumped most of them before I came back here, which I kind of regretted because some I would have liked to have hung on to. But it's been important for me to do my own freedom of information requests. So I'm not getting it secondhand. I'm actually directly talking to these people, getting the actual documents or not getting the documents. So for further reading, information about what I'm following, and it's very hard to know whether you've got everything right. I believe the best technical investigation that's out there, and it is mainly focused on the technical side, is peace911.org. The best resource on the astounding lack of evidence supporting the official narrative is the book by Elias Davidson called Hijacking America's Mind on 9/11. Very, very thorough, going through, which I have done to a lesser extent. A lot of the FBI's interviews with people, all the telephone calls being made, especially from the planes, the lack of evidence of the perpetrators, and also the forensic investigation of the planes. I don't agree with some of the conclusions Davidson comes to, which isn't in his book, but I know outside of that. Just because a plane hasn't been identified doesn't mean that there's no plane. I don't know if he actually believes that, but he hints towards it. The third point there is reinvestigate 9/11. That's just that they were the first group I kind of hooked up with. Just they're based in the UK, had things going on. And although they are probably top heavy on the architect and engineers side of things, You know, they try and do a lot of good work in this country. Like I said, my legal battle is going to be a long, old process. The easiest way of following what I'm doing is probably to follow my social media thing, my Twitter handle there. What I have found interesting is that one of the founders of Reinvestigate 9/11 lives in Hove, and Ray Savage, who's an ex-counter-terrorism officer, lives in West Sussex. Tony Rourke lives in Chichester, and Chris Coverdale, who's a tax and war crime specialist, lives in Rye. Sussex is quite an active 9/11 council to be living in. Anyway, my goal, and you know, even though I'm sure my wife at times would like me to not be carrying on with this so much, my mum supports me fully in what I'm doing. You know, I am not going to stop trying to get, at a very minimum, a fresh inquest into my brother's death. And who knows, it could lead to a public inquiry. But either way, it will start to officially, although some would argue it's not necessary to do that, to officially expose the lack of evidence supporting the official conspiracy theory. And in the words of Cynthia McKinney, expose the lies of their government. Thank you.
We've got a few minutes for some questions. So, questions?
Matt, do you have a campaign fund?
Um,
Would you like to contribute to your worthy cause?
I don't have one. I have been looking at, there's a crowdfunding justice platform that's been set up. It's tricky at the moment because I know that I need legal aid to submit the application to open the inquest. And from my conversations with a friend who's legally trained, she said inquests are very, very pernickety. They're a very specialist area of law, and you have to have someone with a lot of experience at dealing with inquests. So there's that initial step, and then obviously if we are lucky enough for it to be submitted to the High Court, the Attorney General to the High Court, and they allow a fresh inquest, which there's no grounds not to. I think the bones are sufficient new evidence to request a fresh inquest. Then obviously to actually have the inquest, that's when I would need to have proper legal representation. Along with my polymath mate, and a mate from school, we are looking at different ways. One of them's a marketing genius, and we are looking at ways in which we can build a platform, because it's going to, you know, I can only rely so far on pro bono because it's going to be a long, drawn out process. I mean, I said particularly the States, but you know, in the UK it's still going to require a hell of a lot of resources. I've contacted people like Liberty and Inquest, actually a charity called Inquest. I mean, it's outside the remit really of what Inquest do. They look after people who have died in police custody mainly. But no, I don't have anything set up per se. But I know it's not going to be cheap. And even if I do get someone pro bono, it's a big ask for someone to do it for the length of time that's going to be required.
You tried judicial review. You've gone that route.
For the inquest, or for the BBC, I didn't bother doing it. I just did my own appeal at the Lewis Crown Court.
Right.
The judicial review.
Well, it's where there's been a miscarriage of justice or a misrepresentation, or people are being falsely prosecuted, or that kind of thing.
I've heard of the term, but I think I get mixed with something else. I mean, I'm talking with a lawyer in the UK right now, and we are looking at my options. I said I've got a friend who's also legally trained, but it's kind of also trying to, you know, I've got 3 young kids and all the rest of it. I've got real life to be looking after. I can't scatter it too much. So for me, initially, the focus is going to be, I've had an ex-Attorney General say to me, you should be able to open an inquest based on the new evidence. That's got to be my starting point. Because I think off the back of that, hopefully, I would then garner enough interest, not perhaps from the mainstream media, but then to help with funding and stuff like that. I've also got good contacts at various people, David Icke, Infowars, Marketing Engineers, Reinvestigate 9/11 people, so I've got a way of reaching out to people, but, you know, It's tricky. I mean, to give you an example of Tony Rourke. That was a crowd-funded film. He did an interview on Infowars, and I think within a couple of days he'd had 3,000 donated through that. But more importantly, someone watched it and gave him 25 grand, which basically made the film come about. He thought he'd have to skimp on a budget of 5 grand, which is very hard if you're trying to travel around the world and do interviews with people. So it is possible. But a judicial review, I'll have to look into that and see if it's something that might be applicable at some stage, maybe not initially.
Well, I can tell you cases where it's worked and leads to changing the law.
If I can get your details, and maybe that'd be good, yeah.
And another possibility is to convene a grand jury. Ray Savage would tell you all about that.
Yeah. That crossing over sort of common law type stuff, yeah. I mean, had quite a few conversations with people about different routes in. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm interested in when you talked about the identifying the remains, and it occurred to me, you said there are a lot that haven't been identified, but have any of the remains of passengers on the plane been identified?
I've had conversations with both the Deputy Forensic Investigation of 9/11 and another lady there. All they can tell me, and they are very removed from the process, all the remains of apparently passengers, the crew and the hijackers have all been identified from the 77 and 93. Now, they're not involved in the process, the chain of custody and all that. Also, is in one of my freedom of information requests to the FBI, just go back to the World Trade Center. They created basically what are called Z-code profiles. So however the FBI got them, steering wheel swabs, toothbrushes, etc., they presented something, called it a Z-code, said this is hijacker, whatever. And they went through each of the 5 alleged 5 hijackers at World Trade for both planes. And I'm presuming I've done something similar for the planes. But to my knowledge, they've identified everyone. On AA-11, they've only identified 50%. And I was absolutely staggered to find out that the majority of those remains, and again, I'll talk about something in a second about my impression of people I've been dealing with. There was a Bankers Trust building, there was no direct line of sight from the North Tower. South Tower's in the way, and this is the remains they found on top of this building some 5-6 years later. And in total there was nearly 800 remains, but apparently they all fit into a shoebox, so we're talking tiny remains. If you read the FEMA reports, apparently there were some seats and life jackets, rags there, but there's 800 remains. From those remains, they identified practically all those 50% of people from AA-11. Now, I'm not an expert in gas thermodynamics, but what you're talking about there is from the impact, that cloud, the central vaporization of people, would have to have been covered up. I've got no idea what the wind was doing, but you're talking it would have had to have been lifted, curled round, and dumped a hell of a distance away from the North Tower. And there was only a tiny exit at the back. So, I mean, it is, the more and more you look into stuff, it's just like, this is nuts. But what I would stress is I've spoken to a lot of people. I don't think there's a mad conspiracy in terms of a huge number of people, too much risk. I think it was a very small, controlled group, and it's just the information is power, and you're very compartmentalised, and that's how you can control it. And like I said, the people at the chief medical examiner, they're just presented with, they go through, check their stuff. Once it flags a Z code, those remains are removed. I believe they said it's handed over to the actual chief medical examiner, and then it goes off to La La Land with the FBI. So they don't store, once identified, any of the hijackers' remains. But as far as I know, they have been.
I was thinking the passengers and the families of the passengers on the plane, they must have a similar interest to yourself in wanting to get to the truth, surely.
That's a complex question. I mean, obviously for all of them, they have apparently been identified. So I've spoken to family members in the UK who haven't, and they're ones with more of the nagging questions because they've got nothing. That's a really hard thing, and it's hard for me interacting with the people when I was at the memorial today, and it is tricky. I've had not particularly great amount of success talking about this with other families, but it's hard because we don't see each other very often, and because I lived abroad for 6 years, I've not really been involved in the every year trip to the memorial and just socially mixing with them. So, but I mean, I stayed silent. I wasn't questioning it, but I stayed silent for 10, 11 years. I hope that there's other people who are, wherever they are in that path of coming forward or questioning stuff. I have to believe that there are more people like me. And I said, within a year, I've got 2 other victim family members who, at least we agree on, certainly that the official story, there's lots of stuff being hidden from us. But I can't speak for the family. I only know my own.
No, I mean this
story.
thing about people saying that there weren't any planes involved, but surely then if they did identify remains of passengers on the plane, then the plane must have been involved.
I'm not going to support no planes theories, but no, not necessarily so. They could have been killed elsewhere, but I'm not going to go into that. The point, and I don't believe that. But like I said, the people who are doing the actual identification of remains are so far removed. They're just presented with the remains, and so they have no idea where it's come from.
Max, can I ask you a quick question, please? There seems to be a lot of confusion as to whether, or exactly what happened overall, but one of the things you mentioned, you said that if the air traffic controller had done something different, then the planes might not have hit the tower and the events might have been different that day. But if the buildings were rigged to explode anyway, surely they're going to explode them, like we saw with Building 7.
Well, no, I mean,
regardless of aeroplanes, they were rigged to go.
No, the first point about they'd hijack them quickly, that was just my observation that if they really were 4 independent teams, you would do it as quickly as possible, knowing that there's probably, assuming you would know about the other plots, but either way you'd do it quickly. You wouldn't wait as long as you did, and again in a sequential manner. But no, I believe that the critical first test of the system was AA11, and if for whatever reason that remote control didn't work, it probably would have not happened that day, and they probably would have bought in what they were doing.
And then gone back in and taken the bombs out later on.
Well, no, not to speculate there, but
well, let's speculate, because if they was in there and they didn't let them off, they would have had to have taken them out. And come on, let's face it, they were planning to. Sorry, I don't mean to upset anybody or shout too much, but Building 7 didn't get hit by anything, as we saw, and that fell down like a pack of cards with no resistance. It was obviously brought down with something, like the other ones were, and the planes were kind of a cover story, possibly, to some extent, whether they were there or not. That was part of the story.
Of course, it's part of the story, of course, but without the planes, you've got a real problem explaining, because they obviously hadn't built the story up. They needed something to say why the targets have been hit or exploded or controlled demolition. So for me, without the hijacks, without the plane cover story, there would have been no 9/11. Because you've got a lot more can of worms. How the hell has someone got into a building and rigged explosive? Which of course the whole thing with the planes and the fire has avoided all that in line of inquiry.
I think the whole 9/11 thing is so deep and so complicated. One of the things I do find interesting is that the Pentagon's opening ceremony was September 11th, 1941. Now, I'm not saying that this was planned back as far as then, but I just do see it as quite a coincidence. I know I'm interested in dates and numerology and things like that, and I just thought that was very interesting. It's there on paper that that actually happened, and I just think that's interesting that 60 years exactly to the date, they had this opening ceremony.
I've read a lot around 9/11 and looked at all sorts of different angles. Obviously for me, the focus is on trying to get the truth for justice. But I am aware there's a lot of stuff in the background. There's that, is it the head of the World Bank, who came out with a whole bunch of numerology. Was it
Yeah.
World Bank?
Oh, Christine
Christine
Lagarde.
Lagarde,
Yeah, you know,
seven.
Couple of
Yeah.
months ago.
Yeah.
You do have some numerology in there.
Yeah. I'm sure.
Just the stuff, I mean, I'm not into that, but I noticed, right, you've got an AA 11, right, 11 in Twin Towers. You've got an AA 77, right, July 7 bombings. The people that were working against you, you mentioned were, what was her name? Rena somebody. So I wrote it down here.
Working again.
It was, yeah, Ellen.
Mariana.
Yeah, two L's in Helen, 2 L's in Helen's team, and the other woman was Gallup. And, I mean, these people put these people there almost to piss in the face.
Well,
Possibly.
I can make a point. One of the most obvious numerical aspects of this is if you presume this event was planned to become a feature of the popular culture in the US to facilitate the justification for all the other things that followed Iraq, Afghanistan, bear in mind that the American equivalent of telephoning 999 is to telephone 911.
Yeah, I know it's all there.
Yeah.
But one thing I would say for your own health is don't hold on to this for too long. Because I thought...
I had the depression for 10 years, it's all on. I'm in a beautiful, beautiful state.
No, it's just that I fought a legal battle for 8 years against the NHBC. And them, their lawyers, Eastbourne Borough Council, the MP were vile in their cover-up of what went on. And when it was all over, I was just so relieved. And at some point you might...
I want to get it involved for the American, just get it into the system. I don't want to be any part of that.
No,
I've gone for years and years.
Yeah,
but in this country, in theory, it should be shorter.
Yeah.
No, I'm going to take your advice, but I'm in a very decent place.
Sure.
Matt, just as a last question, because we're going to have to finish. This is quite sensitive, but have you considered having an independent forensic investigation into your brother's remains to see what was happening at the moment he died?
I have had conversations with the medical examiner because, as I said, my mum was worried about fire, and I talked about, can you find out if there was fire? How did he die? Was it through smoke, inhalation? Obviously, you need lungs for that and stuff. I also had to couch it very carefully because I was still tapping them for lots of information. Said a lot of people talk about controlled demolition. How could are the remains what you would expect from demolition? And all she could say is what you'd expect from pressure and effectively a collapse. But obviously there's nothing really to compare it to, so it is tricky. And all these people, they're all bone experts. So not so much the wet tissue, but they are experts with bones. No, I mean, I've not thought, and it's not something I would want to put my mum or dad through. And I don't really know what it would benefit us. I mean, I said we do have the unrepatriated remains in New York, and my last conversation about the likelihood of more remains with them about a year ago said, yeah, almost certainly. Because that's just the way it has been. It's tiny fragments of the same people being re-identified over and over again. I said only 5 in the last 2.5, actually 2 3/4 years now. It's trickled down to practically nothing now.
Do you not worry that piece might go missing?
No, I mean well, no, because there's loads of other bones there that obviously had a similar event. There's still 7,000 something. But I mean, I was really shocked at the fact they have nearly complete bodies there, but not claimed, but with strong DNA profiles. But I mean, the one thing that's really struck home to me was when I spoke with the father of the son who had the 86% body, was this disparate, this range of nothing, 2 or 3%, and a whole body. And for me, they're all on the same floor. They've all suffered the same sort of height and crushing, etc. The only thing I think can do that is proximity to explosives, because we know all the concrete was pulverised, and that can be created with an explosive against the core, pushing, and you get overpressure against the concrete, and it will just pulverise it in all directions. And that for me is obviously the closer you were, the stairwells, etc., the more likely is nothing left of you. And as you went further and further out, the more likely you were to have something intact. That's just my feeling and my discussion with a few people. I mean, unfortunately, I've not been able to get hold of a medical examiner who's willing to discuss with me what you would expect to find from explosives and stuff. I mean, that's it. I mean, I'm able to kind of, I don't know how I compartmentalise this, but I can do these conversations. But.
Well, listen, we're going to end there, but I'm sure you'll all agree. It's very powerful. He's a very brave man. I'm sure we all wish him well in the investigation. And Matt, thank you for coming on to speak to us tonight. Thank you very much.
The information where unknown forces strike the edge of ecology.